Welcome to Realist Quill. Tonight, we journey into the Pride Lands to uncover the complete story of one of Disney's most complex villains. From his birth as Prince Taka to his final moments atop Pride Rock, this is the tale of jealousy, ambition, and the consequences of choosing darkness over light. So settle in, close your eyes, and let the winds of Africa carry you into this epic saga. In the heart of Africa, where the great baobab trees stretch their ancient branches toward endless skies, the Pride Lands flourished under the rule of King Ahadi. The golden savanna stretched as far as the eye could see, dotted with acacia trees and watering holes that sustained countless creatures in the great circle of life. It was here, in the magnificent den carved into the face of Pride Rock, that two lion cubs were born to the royal family. The first cub, golden and strong, was named Mufasa, destined from birth to inherit the throne. The second, darker in coat with piercing green eyes, was called Taka, meaning want or desire in the ancient tongue. From their earliest days, the contrast between the brothers was evident, not just in their appearance, but in their very nature. Mufasa possessed a natural nobility that drew others to him. Even as a cub, he displayed the qualities that would make him a great king: courage, wisdom, and an innate understanding of the delicate balance that governed their world. He moved with confidence through the Pride Lands, already showing signs of the majestic mane that would one day frame his noble features. Taka, however, was different. Smaller and leaner than his golden brother, he compensated with cunning and intelligence. Where Mufasa relied on strength and natural charisma, Taka learned to survive through wit and manipulation. His mind was sharp, always calculating, always planning. Even as a young cub, he displayed an unsettling ability to turn situations to his advantage. The cub's father, King Ahadi, was a wise and just ruler who loved both his sons dearly. Yet even he couldn't ignore the growing tension between them. Mufasa, as the heir apparent, received the lion's share of attention and grooming for leadership. He was taught the ways of kingship, the responsibilities of ruling, and the sacred duty to protect all creatures within the Pride Lands. Taka, meanwhile, found himself increasingly relegated to the shadows. As the second son, his role was never clearly defined. He was expected to support his brother, to serve as an advisor and protector, but never to rule. This distinction, subtle at first, would grow into a festering wound that would shape the rest of his life. The lionesses of the pride watched the cubs grow with mixed emotion. They could see the nobility in Mufasa, the way he naturally assumed leadership among the other cubs, his genuine concern for others. But they also noticed something troubling in Taka's eyes, a hunger that went beyond mere appetite, a desire that seemed to grow rather than diminish as he aged. Queen Uru, their mother, tried her best to nurture both cubs equally. She saw the potential for greatness in both her sons, but she also recognized the dangerous path that Taka's jealousy might lead him down. She would often find him alone on the edges of Pride Rock, staring out at the vast kingdom that would never be his green eyes reflecting a mixture of longing and resentment. As the seasons passed, the differences between the brothers became more pronounced. Mufasa grew into his role as future king with grace and dignity. He formed friendships easily, showed compassion for the weakest members of their pride, and demonstrated a natural understanding of justice that impressed even the oldest and wisest lions. Taka, by contrast, grew more isolated and bitter. He excelled in areas that Mufasa struggled with: strategy, planning, and understanding the darker aspects of lion nature. He was often found in the company of the hyenas who lurked at the borders of the Pride Lands, creatures that most lions avoided. There was something about their savage cunning that appealed to him, a recognition of kindred spirits who also lived on the margins of society. The first major rift between the brothers occurred during their adolescence, in an incident that would later earn Taka his infamous nickname. The details vary depending on who tells the story, but the outcome was always the same: a confrontation that left the younger brother scarred, both physically and emotionally. Some say it happened during a hunting lesson gone wrong, when Taka's jealousy led him to attempt something beyond his abilities. Others claim it was the result of a deliberate challenge, Taka's attempt to prove himself equal to his golden brother. The most commonly told version speaks of a tragic accident involving a water buffalo stampede, where Mufasa's attempt to save his brother resulted in the very injury he was trying to prevent. Regardless of the exact circumstances, the scar that marked Taka's face became a symbol of everything that had gone wrong in his life. The thin, dark line that ran over his left eye served as a constant reminder of his inadequacy, his failure to measure up to his brother's greatness. From that day forward, he was no longer Prince Taka. He became Scar, a name that spoke to his damaged soul as much as his marked face. The physical wound healed, but the emotional damage ran much deeper. Scar's resentment toward Mufasa intensified, fed by every act of kindness his brother showed, every gesture of concern that felt like pity. He began to see Mufasa's nobility not as genuine virtue but as a cruel reminder of his own shortcoming. As they reached adulthood, the brothers' paths diverged completely. Mufasa assumed his role as heir with dignity and wisdom, earning the respect and love of all who knew him. He formed a close bond with Seju the Hornbill, who served as the king's major domo, and showed particular kindness to the smaller creatures of the Pride Lands, who were often overlooked by other lions. Scar, meanwhile, retreated further into the shadows. He cultivated relationships with the outcasts and misfits of their world, the hyenas who scavenged at the borders, the vultures who fed on carrion, the creatures that others feared or despised. In their company he found a twisted form of acceptance, a place where his dark thoughts and ambitious schemes were not just tolerated, but encouraged. The hyenas in particular became Scar's closest ally. Led by a female named Shenzi, along with her companions Banzai and Ed, they represented everything that the noble lions of the Pride Lands stood against: chaos, cruelty, and the abandonment of the natural order. Yet in their savage cunning, Scar saw tools that could be used to achieve his ultimate goal. King Ahadi, growing older and wiser with each passing season, watched the growing division between his sons with deep concern. He could see the darkness growing in Scar's heart, the way resentment was poisoning his younger son's soul. He tried to bridge the gap between the brothers, to find a role for Scar that would utilize his unique talents, without threatening the stability of the kingdom. But Scar's ambition had grown beyond any conventional role. He no longer simply wanted recognition or respect. He wanted the throne itself. The idea consumed him, driving him to spend long hours plotting and planning, studying the weaknesses of the pride and building alliances with those who shared his dissatisfaction with the current order. The transformation was subtle but unmistakable. The playful, if jealous, cub had become a calculating and dangerous adult. His humor had turned sardonic, his intelligence had become cunning, and his natural charisma had evolved into something manipulative and dark. He learned to hide his true intentions behind a mask of civility, playing the role of the loyal brother while secretly planning his brother's downfall. As King Ahadi's reign drew toward its end, the entire Pride Lands watched to see how the succession would unfold. Mufasa was the obvious choice, beloved by all and clearly prepared for leadership. But those who looked closely could see Scar lurking in the shadows, his green eyes burning with an ambition that would not be easily satisfied. The stage was set for a confrontation that would determine not just the fate of the Pride Lands, but the very nature of the circle of life itself. One brother represented the natural order, wisdom and benevolent leadership. The other embodied ambition unchecked, resentment transformed into hatred, and the dangerous allure of power at any cost. In the golden light of the African sunset, with the great baobab trees casting long shadows across the savannah, the Pride Lands stood at a crossroad. The choices made in the coming seasons would echo through generations, shaping the destiny of countless creatures and testing the very foundations of the world they all share. The passing of King Ahadi marked the beginning of a new era in the Pride Lands. one that would be defined by the stark contrast between two very different approaches to leadership. Mufasa's coronation was a celebration that brought together creatures from across the vast kingdom, all united in their respect and hope for their new king. The ceremony itself was a magnificent affair, held at the peak of Pride Rock as the sun reached its zenith. Rafiki, the wise old mandrill who served as the kingdom's shaman, painted the traditional symbols on Mufasa's forehead while chanting ancient blessings in the old tongue. The assembled animals, elephants, giraffes, zebras, and countless others, bowed in acknowledgement of their new ruler. Scar stood in the shadows during the ceremony, his face a mask of controlled indifference. To the casual observer, he appeared to be dutifully supporting his brother's ascension to the throne. But those who knew him well, particularly the hyenas who had become his closest confidants, could see the fury burning behind his green eyes. Each cheer from the crowd, each expression of joy and hope, was like salt in the wound of his own frustrated ambition. As King Mufasa settled into his role, his natural leadership qualities flourished. He ruled with a perfect balance of strength and compassion, understanding that true power came not from fear, but from the willing loyalty of his subjects. He spent his days patrolling the Pride Lands, settling disputes, ensuring the delicate balance of nature was maintained, and learning from the wisdom of those who had served his father. One of Mufasa's first acts as king was to formally designate Scar as his heir, at least until he had cubs of his own. This gesture, meant as an olive branch to his brother, had the opposite effect. Rather than feeling honored by the recognition, Scar saw it as a hollow consolation prize, a reminder that he would only ever be king if something terrible happened to Mufasa. The irony was not lost on him. He was next in line for the throne, yet had never felt further from power. Mufasa's strength and youth made it likely that he would rule for many years, probably long enough to father cubs who would supersede Scar in the line of succession. The temporary nature of his position as heir only intensified his resentment. Scar's response to his brother's kindness was to withdraw even further from Pride activities. While Mufasa spent his time with the lionesses, learning their hunting strategies and understanding the needs of the Pride, Scar increasingly isolated himself. He could often be found alone in the elephant graveyard, the forbidden territory that bordered their kingdom, where the bleached bones of ancient giants created a landscape of death and decay. It was in this desolate place that Scar felt most at home. The elephant graveyard was a realm where the normal rules didn't apply, where the circle of life had been broken and replaced by something darker and more chaotic. Here, among the bones and shadows, he could plot and plan without the constant reminder of his brother's success. The hyenas who inhabited this wasteland became Scar's primary companions, and eventually his co-conspirators. Unlike the noble creatures of the Pride Lands, the hyenas were outcasts by nature, scavengers who survived on the edges of society. In Scar they found someone who understood their resentment toward the established order, someone who shared their hunger for power and their willingness to break the rules to get it. Shenzi, the pack's leader, was particularly drawn to Scar's vision of a different kind of kingdom. She was intelligent and ruthless, qualities that Scar both admired and recognized as useful to his cause. Under her leadership, the hyenas had survived in the harsh environment of the elephant graveyard, but they hungered for more, for the rich hunting grounds of the Pride Lands, for the respect that had always been denied them. Banzai, aggressive and hot-tempered, represented the raw violence that would be necessary to overthrow the current order. His hatred for the lions was personal and visceral, born from years of being driven away from the good hunting grounds and forced to subsist on scraps. In Scar's promises of revolution, he saw the chance for revenge against those who had kept his kind in poverty. Ed, though seemingly simple, possessed a savage cunning that made him dangerous in his own right. His apparent madness masked a deep understanding of violence and chaos, qualities that would prove invaluable in the dark days to come. Together, The three hyenas formed the core of what would become Scar's personal army. As months passed into years, Scar's conspiracy began to take shape. He spent countless hours with the hyenas, learning about their strengths and weaknesses, understanding how they could be used to achieve his goals. He studied the Pride Lands from a different perspective than his brother, not as a kingdom to be protected but as a prize to be won. Where Mufasa saw the delicate balance of nature, Scar saw opportunities for exploitation. Where his brother valued the traditional ways, Scar envisioned a new order based on strength and cunning rather than wisdom and compassion. He began to see himself not just as a potential king, but as a revolutionary who would transform their world according to his own vision. The first test of Scar's evolving philosophy came during a severe drought that struck the Pride Land. The great river that provided water for countless creatures began to run low, and the usual watering holes started to dry up. King Mufasa responded by implementing water rationing, ensuring that all creatures had access to the remaining supplies while working to find new sources. Scar saw the crisis differently. He viewed it as an opportunity to demonstrate the weakness of his brother's approach, to show that compassion and cooperation were luxuries that the Pride Lands could no longer afford. He began whispering to anyone who would listen that a stronger king would simply take what was needed, that the survival of the lions should take precedence over the welfare of lesser creatures. When his subtle campaign of discontent failed to gain traction among the Pride, Scar realized that his path to power would require more dramatic action. The loyalty that Mufasa inspired was deeper than he had anticipated, rooted not just in tradition but in genuine affection and respect. To break that bond, he would need to do something that would shake the very foundations of their society. It was during this period that Scar's relationship with his brother reached a new low. Where once there had been sibling rivalry and jealousy, now there was genuine hatred. Scar began to see Mufasa not just as an obstacle to his ambitions, but as a symbol of everything that was wrong with their world. His brother's goodness became, in his twisted perspective, a form of weakness that deserved to be punished. The psychological transformation was complete. The cub who had once sought his brother's approval had become a lion who dreamed of his brother's destruction. The prince who had wanted to be loved had become a schemer who was content to be feared. The transformation from Taka to Scar was not just about a physical mark. It represented a fundamental change in his very soul. As Scar's plots grew more ambitious, he began to study the methods of past usurpers and tyrants. He learned about the importance of timing, about the need to eliminate not just his primary target, but anyone who might challenge his rule afterward. He understood that a successful coup required not just the removal of the current king, but the complete destruction of the system that had put him in power. The hyenas, recognizing the opportunity that Scar represented, began to organize themselves into a more formidable force. Under Shenzi's leadership, they started conducting more coordinated raids on the borders of the Pride Lands, testing the responses of the lionesses and learning the patterns of the patrols. They were no longer just scavengers hoping for scraps. They were becoming an army preparing for war. Meanwhile, Mufasa remained largely unaware of the growing threat. His noble nature made it difficult for him to imagine that his own brother could be plotting against him. When reports reached him of increased hyena activity, he assumed it was simply the natural result of the drought driving the scavengers to desperation. He responded with increased patrols and stronger border defenses, never suspecting that the real threat was living within Pride Rock itself. The stage was being set for a confrontation that would determine the fate of the Pride Lands. On one side stood Mufasa, representing the traditional values of honor, justice, and the natural order. On the other lurked Scar, embodying ambition, resentment, and the dark promise of power unchecked by conscience. As the seasons turned and the drought finally ended, the Pride Lands seemed to return to normal. The rains came, the river flowed again, and life resumed its ancient pattern. But beneath the surface, in the shadows and secret places, The forces of change were gathering strength. Scar's patience, honed by years of waiting and planning, was about to be tested by the greatest opportunity of his life. The circle of life was about to be broken, and from its destruction, a new and darker order would emerge. The morning sun painted Pride Rock in shades of gold and amber, as all the creatures of the kingdom gathered for a celebration that would change everything. Word had spread across the savannah like wildfire. King Mufasa and Queen Sarabi had welcomed a cub, a prince who would one day inherit the throne of the Pride Lands. From his position in the shadows beneath Pride Rock, Scar watched the gathering with growing dread. Every animal that arrived, from the smallest mouse to the mightiest elephant, represented another nail in the coffin of his ambitions. The birth of this cub meant that his own position as heir to the throne had just become worthless, a temporary designation that would end the moment the young prince came of age. Rafiki, the kingdom's wise mandrill, made his way up the ancient path to Pride Rock's summit, carrying the ceremonial paints and fruits that would be used in the presentation ceremony. The old shaman moved with the slow dignity of age, but there was joy in his step and wisdom in his eyes. He had served 3 generations of kings, and he understood the significance of this moment better than anyone. As the ceremony began, Scar felt each ritual gesture like a physical blow. He watched Rafiki paint the traditional symbols on the tiny cub's forehead, marking him as the future king. He saw Mufasa's pride and joy as he held his son aloft, presenting him to the assembled multitude. Most painful of all, he witnessed the spontaneous celebration that erupted from the crowd. The trumpeting of elephants, the calls of birds, the roars of approval from every corner of the kingdom. The cub himself was unremarkable at first glance, small, golden-furred like his father, with bright, curious eyes that seemed to take in everything around him. But to Scar he represented the end of hope, the final barrier between himself and the throne he had coveted for so long. This tiny, helpless creature had just stolen his birthright simply by being born. As the ceremony concluded and the crowd began to disperse, Scar retreated to the deepest shadows of Pride Rock. His mind raced with the implications of what had just occurred. All his years of patient waiting, all his careful cultivation of allies and resources, all his dreams of someday ruling the Pride Lands, everything had just become infinitely more complicated. The immediate question was obvious. What was this cub's name? It didn't take long for the answer to reach him through the Pride's gossip network. The prince would be called Simba, meaning lion in the ancient tongue. It was a name that spoke to strength and nobility, perfectly suited for a future king. To Scar, it was just another reminder of how easily his brother seemed to achieve everything he himself had struggled for. In the days following Simba's presentation, Scar's behavior became increasingly erratic. He spent more time away from Pride Rock, often disappearing for days at a time into the forbidden territories where the hyenas dwelt. When he did return, he was sullen and withdrawn, speaking to no one unless absolutely necessary. The other lionesses began to whisper among themselves about Scar's strange behavior. Some attributed it to jealousy over his displaced position in the succession. Others, more charitably, suggested that he was simply adjusting to his new role as uncle, rather than heir. But a few of the older, wiser lionesses recognized something darker in his demeanor. A bitterness that went beyond mere disappointment. Mufasa, focused on his duties as a new father and king, initially paid little attention to his brother's moods. He was learning to balance his responsibilities to the kingdom with his desire to spend time with his infant son. Every moment with Simba was precious, from watching the cub's first attempts to walk to seeing the wonder in his eyes as he experienced the world around him. The king's days were filled with the dual challenges of ruling and parenting. In the mornings he would hold court, listening to disputes and making decisions that affected the lives of thousands of creatures. In the afternoons he would patrol the Pride Lands, ensuring that the delicate balance of nature was maintained. But his favorite times were the quiet evenings when he could simply be a father, teaching his son about their heritage and the responsibilities that would someday be his. Sarabi, meanwhile, proved to be everything a queen and mother should be. Strong, wise, and fiercely protective, she took to motherhood with natural grace. She could often be seen with Simba, teaching him the basic skills he would need as he grew: how to stalk, how to pounce, how to read the subtle signs of the natural world around them. As weeks turned to months, Simba grew from a helpless infant into a curious and energetic cub. His personality began to emerge, revealing traits that both delighted and occasionally concerned his parents. He was brave to the point of recklessness, curious about everything around him, and possessed of a natural confidence that sometimes bordered on arrogance. It was during this period that Scar began to take more interest in his nephew. To the casual observer, it appeared that he was finally accepting his role as uncle and attempting to build a relationship with the future king. He would spend time with Simba, telling him stories and teaching him about the Pride Lands. But those who knew Scar well might have noticed something calculating in these interactions: a careful study of the cub's personality and weaknesses. The first real test of Scar's influence over his nephew came when Simba was still very young. One afternoon, while Sarabi was resting and Mufasa was away on patrol, Scar approached the energetic cub with what seemed like a casual suggestion. He mentioned, almost offhandedly, that there were parts of the Pride Lands that Simba had never seen, places where only the bravest lions dared to venture. The seed was planted expertly. Scar knew his nephew well enough to understand that the young prince's curiosity and desire to prove his bravery would eventually overcome his parents' warnings about staying close to Pride Rock. He didn't need to directly encourage Simba to explore forbidden territories. He simply needed to make the idea appealing and then wait for the cub's nature to do the rest. This pattern of subtle manipulation became Scar's primary method of interaction with his nephew. He never directly contradicted Mufasa's teachings or openly encouraged dangerous behavior. Instead, he planted ideas and suggestions, allowing Simba's own personality to lead him toward the conclusions that Scar desired. The psychological complexity of Scar's approach reflected his growing sophistication as a manipulator. He understood that direct confrontation would only alert Mufasa to his intentions, while obvious attempts to harm Simba would unite the entire pride against him. Instead, he chose a path that was far more insidious, gradually shaping his nephew's development while maintaining the appearance of being a caring uncle. During this period, Scar's alliance with the hyenas also deepened. They began to see him not just as a disgruntled prince, but as a potential leader who could deliver on his promises of access to the Pride Lands resource. The arrangement was mutually beneficial. Scar gained a private army loyal only to him, while the hyenas gained hope for a better future under his rule. Shenzi, in particular, proved to be an invaluable ally. Her intelligence matched Scar's own, and her understanding of strategy and tactics complemented his natural cunning. Together, they began to develop more sophisticated plans, moving beyond simple raids and petty harassment to consider more dramatic actions that could change the balance of power in their favor. The hyenas' territory in the elephant graveyard became Scar's second home, a place where he could drop his mask of civility and reveal his true nature. Here, surrounded by the bones of the dead and the savage laughter of his allies, he could speak freely about his ambitions and his growing hatred for his brother's reign. It was in these secret councils that the first real plots against Mufasa began to take shape. The discussions were careful and theoretical at first, exploring various scenarios and possibilities. But as time passed and Simba grew older, the conversations became more specific and urgent. The window of opportunity was narrowing. Soon, Simba would be old enough to begin formal training as the future king, making him even more central to the pride's future. Scar understood that any action he took would need to accomplish multiple objectives simultaneously. He would need to eliminate Mufasa, remove Simba from the succession, and position himself as the only viable alternative to lead the Pride Lands. The complexity of this challenge was daunting, but it also appealed to his intellectual pride. This would be the ultimate test of his cunning and planning abilities. As Simba approached his first birthday, the Pride Lands seemed to be entering a golden age. Under Mufasa's wise leadership, the kingdom prospered. The rains came regularly, The herds were healthy, and conflicts between different species were rare. The circle of life functioned smoothly, with each creature playing its role in the greater harmony of nature. But beneath this peaceful surface, forces of change were gathering strength. In the shadows of Pride Rock and the wasteland of the Elephant Graveyard, plans were being made that would shatter this harmony forever. The stage was being set for a tragedy that would test the very foundations of the Pride Lands and determine whether the values of wisdom and compassion could survive against the darker impulses of ambition and revenge. As the sun set over the African savanna, painting the sky in brilliant shades of red and gold, few could have imagined that they were witnessing the end of an era. The golden age of Mufasa's reign was about to give way to something far darker, and at the center of that darkness stood Scar, patient and calculating, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The circle of life was about to be broken, and from its shattered remains, a new and terrible order would emerge. As Simba grew from an infant into an active and curious cub, the dynamics within the royal family became increasingly complex. The young prince's natural exuberance and confidence, while endearing to most of the pride, only served to intensify Scar's growing resentment. Every display of Simba's potential, every moment of pride that crossed Mufasa's face when watching his son, was like a fresh wound to Scar's already damaged psyche. The daily routines of Pride Rock took on new patterns as Simba became more mobile and adventurous. Mufasa would rise before dawn to patrol the borders and attend to his kingly duties, but he always made time to spend with his son. These father-son moments became the highlight of both their days. Mufasa teaching Simba about the responsibilities of leadership, the importance of understanding all creatures in their kingdom, and the sacred nature of the circle of life. Scar watched these interactions from the shadows, his green eyes burning with an emotion that went far beyond simple jealousy. He saw in Mufasa's patient instruction everything that he himself had never received. His father, King Ahadi, had loved both his sons, but the demands of preparing the heir had naturally focused more attention on Mufasa. Now, watching his brother repeat this pattern with Simba, old wounds were reopened and new resentments were born. The young prince's personality was emerging more clearly with each passing day. Simba was brave to the point of recklessness, always eager to explore new places and try new things. He had inherited his father's natural charisma and his mother's fierce determination, creating a combination that was both appealing and potentially dangerous. His confidence sometimes bordered on arrogance, and his curiosity often led him into situations that were beyond his ability to handle. These traits, while concerning to his parents, were exactly what Scar had been waiting for. The young prince's overconfidence and desire to prove himself could be exploited, turned into weaknesses that would serve Scar's purposes. He began to study his nephew more carefully, learning his patterns of behavior, understanding his motivations, and identifying the psychological buttons that could be pushed when the time was right. Scar's manipulation of Simba was subtle but constant. During their conversations, he would plant small seeds of doubt about his father's teachings. He would suggest that perhaps Mufasa was being overly cautious, that a truly brave prince would be willing to take risks that others feared. He never directly contradicted his brother's authority, but he consistently undermined it in ways that were designed to appeal to Simba's young ego. One of Scar's most effective techniques was to share carefully edited stories about his own youth and his relationship with Mufasa. He would tell Simba about adventures they had shared as cubs, but he would subtly alter the details to make himself appear more heroic and Mufasa more dependent on others. These stories served multiple purposes. They built a bond between uncle and nephew while simultaneously diminishing Mufasa's reputation in Simba's eyes. The psychological warfare extended beyond direct manipulation of Simba. Scar also began to sow seeds of doubt among the lionesses of the pride, though he was careful to do so in ways that couldn't be traced back to him. He would make casual comments about the challenges facing the kingdom, the difficult decisions that lay ahead, and the heavy burden that leadership placed on any lion. His goal was to create an atmosphere of uncertainty and concern that would make his eventual bid for power seem like a necessary response to crisis. As Simba grew from an infant into an active and curious cub, the dynamics within the royal family became increasingly complex. The young prince's natural exuberance and confidence, while endearing to most of the pride, only served to intensify Scar's growing resentment. Every display of Simba's potential, every moment of pride that crossed Mufasa's face when watching his son, was like a fresh wound to Scar's already damaged psyche. The daily routines of Pride Rock took on new patterns as Simba became more mobile and adventurous. Mufasa would rise before dawn to patrol the borders and attend to his kingly duties, but he always made time to spend with his son. These father-son moments became the highlight of both their days. Mufasa teaching Simba about the responsibilities of leadership, the importance of understanding all creatures in their kingdom, and the sacred nature of the circle of life. Scar watched these interactions from the shadows, his green eyes burning with an emotion that went far beyond simple jealousy. He saw in Mufasa's patient instruction everything that he himself had never received. His father, King Ahadi, had loved both his sons, but the demands of preparing the heir had naturally focused more attention on Mufasa. Now, watching his brother repeat this pattern with Simba, old wounds were reopened and new resentments were born. The young prince's personality was emerging more clearly with each passing day. Simba was brave to the point of recklessness, always eager to explore new places and try new things. He had inherited his father's natural charisma and his mother's fierce determination, creating a combination that was both appealing and potentially dangerous. His confidence sometimes bordered on arrogance, and his curiosity often led him into situations that were beyond his ability to handle. These traits, while concerning to his parents, were exactly what Scar had been waiting for. The young prince's overconfidence and desire to prove himself could be exploited, turned into weaknesses that would serve Scar's purposes. He began to study his nephew more carefully, learning his patterns of behavior, understanding his motivations, and identifying the psychological buttons that could be pushed when the time was right. Scar's manipulation of Simba was subtle but constant. During their conversations, he would plant small seeds of doubt about his father's teachings. He would suggest that perhaps Mufasa was being overly cautious, that a truly brave prince would be willing to take risks that others fear. He never directly contradicted his brother's authority, but he consistently undermined it in ways that were designed to appeal to Simba's young ego. One of Scar's most effective techniques was to share carefully edited stories about his own youth and his relationship with Mufasa. He would tell Simba about adventures they had shared as cubs, but he would subtly alter the details to make himself appear more heroic and Mufasa more dependent on others. These stories served multiple purposes. They built a bond between uncle and nephew while simultaneously diminishing Mufasa's reputation in Simba's eyes. The psychological warfare extended beyond direct manipulation of Simba. Scar also began to sow seeds of doubt among the lionesses of the Pride, though he was careful to do so in ways that couldn't be traced back to him. He would make casual comments about the challenges facing the kingdom, the difficult decisions that lay ahead, and the heavy burden that leadership placed on any lion. His goal was to create an atmosphere of uncertainty and concern that would make his eventual bid for power seem like a necessary response to crisis. Zazu, the red-billed hornbill, who served as Mufasa's major domo and advisor, was one of the first to notice the subtle changes in Pride Rock's atmosphere. As a longtime observer of the royal family, he had seen how jealousy and ambition had poisoned Scar's relationship with his brother. Now he began to detect similar patterns in Scar's interactions with Simba, though the manipulation was far more sophisticated than anything he had witnessed before. The Hornbill's attempts to warn Mufasa about his suspicions were met with gentle dismissal. The king, focused on his duties and trusting in his brother's loyalty, found it difficult to believe that Scar would deliberately harm a member of their own family. This noble blindness to his brother's true nature would prove to be one of Mufasa's greatest weaknesses, a character flaw that Scar was counting on to ensure the success of his plans. As months passed, Scar's secret alliance with the hyenas continued to strengthen. The pack had grown larger and more organized under Shenzi's leadership, attracting outcasts and malcontents from across the region. They were no longer just scavengers hoping for scraps. They had become a disciplined force capable of coordinated action against their enemy. The elephant graveyard served as both headquarters and training ground for this growing army. In the desolate landscape of bleached bones and twisted trees, the hyenas practiced the tactics they would need for the battles to come. They learned to work together, to follow orders and to channel their natural savagery into effective military force. Scar's role in this transformation was crucial. His intelligence and strategic thinking provided the hyenas with something they had always lacked: a unified vision and coherent plan for achieving their goals. Under his guidance, they began to see themselves not as perpetual outcasts, but as a revolutionary force destined to overthrow the established order and claim their rightful place in the world. The ideological foundation of this alliance was built on shared resentment and mutual benefit. The hyenas had been excluded from the Pridelands for generations, forced to survive on the margins while the lions enjoyed the best hunting grounds and water sources. Scar offered them the promise of equality, of a new order where merit and strength would determine status rather than species and birthright. For Scar, the hyenas represented the military force he needed to achieve his ambition. Unlike the lionesses of the Pride, who were bound by loyalty and tradition to support Mufasa, hyenas had no such constraints. They were willing to fight for anyone who promised them a better life, and they had no moral qualms about the methods necessary to achieve their goal. The philosophical corruption of the young prince continued in parallel with these military preparations. Scar worked patiently to erode Simba's respect for his father's teachings, particularly those concerning the circle of life and the responsibilities of leadership. He presented alternative viewpoints that emphasized strength over wisdom, action over patience, and personal glory over service to others. These lessons were delivered with such subtlety that Simba rarely recognized them as challenges to his father's authority. Scar had a gift for making his alternative philosophy seem like natural wisdom, the kind of practical knowledge that came from experience rather than idealistic theory. He positioned himself as the uncle who truly understood the harsh realities of leadership, in contrast to Mufasa's supposedly naive approach. The corruption was not just philosophical, but emotional as well. Scar worked to create distance between Simba and his father, by emphasizing their differences rather than their similarities. He would point out moments when Mufasa seemed disappointed in Simba's behavior, times when the king appeared to be holding his son to impossibly high standards. These observations, while technically accurate, were presented in ways that fostered resentment rather than understanding. The growing tension within the royal family was not lost on Queen Sarabi, who had always been an astute observer of lion politics. She began to notice subtle changes in her son's behavior, moments of defiance that seemed uncharacteristic, questions about his father's decisions that had never occurred to him before, and a growing fascination with the forbidden territories beyond their borders. When she tried to discuss her concerns with Mufasa, he initially dismissed them as the natural challenges of raising a spirited cub. But Sarabi's maternal instincts told her that something deeper was at work. She had seen how Scar watched Simba during family gatherings, the calculating look in his green eyes that spoke of plans being made and opportunities being weighed. The queen's suspicions were confirmed during a conversation she overheard between Scar and Simba one evening, as twilight painted the sky in shades of purple and gold. Hidden behind a rocky outcropping near Pride Rock's summit, she listened as Scar told her son stories about the elephant graveyard, the forbidden territory that no lion was supposed to enter. "Of course your father has told you never to go there," Scar said, his voice carrying just the right tone of casual dismissal. "He's probably right to be cautious. It's a dangerous place, full of shadows and secrets. Only the bravest lions would dare to explore such a realm." Simba's response was exactly what Scar had been hoping for. "I'm not afraid of some old elephant bones. I'm going to be king someday. I should know about every part of my kingdom, even the scary parts." "Oh, I'm sure you would be brave enough," Scar replied smoothly. "But perhaps your father thinks you're still too young. Maybe when you're older, when you've proven yourself ready for such adventures." The manipulation was masterful in its subtlety. Scar had planted the idea of visiting the elephant graveyard while simultaneously challenging Simba's courage and maturity. He had made the forbidden territory seem like a test of worthiness, rather than a genuine danger, knowing that the young prince's pride would make it impossible for him to resist the challenge. Sarabi felt a chill run through her as she realized what she had witnessed. This wasn't the casual conversation between uncle and nephew that it appeared to be. It was a carefully orchestrated manipulation designed to lead her son into danger. She understood now that Scar's interest in Simba was not born of familial affection, but of something far more sinister. That night, she tried once again to express her concerns to Mufasa, this time with greater urgency. But the king, exhausted from a day of settling territorial disputes between the zebra herds, was reluctant to believe that his brother could be capable of deliberately endangering Simba. The bonds of family and the memories of their shared childhood made it difficult for him to accept that Scar had changed so fundamentally. "You're imagining threats where none exist," Mufasa told his queen gently. "Scar has his faults, his jealousy, his bitter humor, but he would never harm our son. Despite everything that has passed between us, he is still my brother." Sarabi wanted to argue further, but she could see the weariness in her mate's eyes and the burden of leadership that weighed so heavily on his shoulder. She decided to keep her own watch on Scar's interactions with Simba, gathering evidence of his manipulation while hoping that her suspicions would prove unfounded. Meanwhile, in the elephant graveyard, Scar's alliance with the hyenas was entering a new phase of development. The pack had grown significantly, attracting not just local outcasts but also refugees from other regions where drought or territorial conflicts had disrupted the natural order. Under Shenzi's military leadership and Scar's strategic guidance, they had evolved from a loose confederation of scavengers into something resembling a proper army. The transformation was remarkable to witness. Hyenas who had once fought each other over scraps of carrion now worked together with disciplined efficiency. They had developed patrol patterns, communication systems, and tactical formations that would allow them to face the lionesses of the Pride Lands on more equal terms. Most importantly, they had developed a shared sense of purpose and destiny that went far beyond mere survival. Scar's influence on this transformation extended beyond mere military organization. He had given the hyenas something they had never possessed before: a coherent ideology that justified their resentment and legitimized their ambitions. He taught them that the current system was not the natural order of things but an artificial construct designed to keep them subjugated. The lions claimed to rule by divine right, Scar would tell his assembled followers during their secret meetings in the graveyard's depths. They speak of the circle of life as if it were sacred law, but it is nothing more than a convenient fiction designed to maintain their privilege. In the true state of nature, the strong rule and the weak serve. Intelligence and cunning are just as valid as physical strength. These philosophical discussions were not mere academic exercise. Scar was laying the ideological groundwork for the revolution to come, creating a belief system that would justify the violence and chaos that would be necessary to overthrow the established order. He understood that lasting change required not just military victory but also a transformation of consciousness among his followers. The hyenas responded to this message with enthusiasm that bordered on religious fervor. For generations, they had been told that their place in the world was predetermined, that they were naturally inferior to the noble lions who ruled the Pride Lands. Now they were being told that this hierarchy was artificial, that they had the right to claim their share of the kingdom's resources through strength and cunning. Denzai, in particular, embraced the new ideology with passionate intensity. His hatred for the lions had always been personal, born from countless humiliations and rejections. But now he could see his resentment as part of a larger struggle for justice and equality. The transformation from petty criminal to revolutionary soldier gave his life a sense of meaning and purpose that it had never possessed before. Ed's response was more primitive but no less significant. Though his apparent madness made complex philosophical discussions impossible, he understood the basic message that strength should be rewarded and weakness punished. His savage laughter during Scar's speeches served as a kind of primitive chorus, a reminder of the violence that would be necessary to achieve their goals. As the seasons passed and Simba grew larger and more confident, the pressure on Scar to act became increasingly intense. The young prince was approaching the age when he would begin formal training in the arts of kingship, when his education would become more structured and his development more closely monitored by his parents. If Scar was going to strike, it would have to be soon. The plan that gradually emerged from his consultations with the hyenas was ambitious in scope and devastating in its implications. It would require perfect timing, absolute commitment from his followers, and a willingness to accept consequences that could not be undone. Most importantly, it would require Scar to cross a line that he had never crossed before. The line between plotting and action, between resentment and murder. The psychological transformation required for this final step was perhaps the most significant of all. Scar had spent years nurturing his hatred for Mufasa. But hatred was very different from actual violence. To move from wanting his brother dead to actually killing him would require a fundamental change in his relationship with morality and conscience. This internal struggle played out over several weeks as spring turned to summer in the Pride Lands. Scar found himself oscillating between moments of absolute determination and periods of doubt and hesitation. The weight of what he was contemplating, fratricide, the destruction of the natural order, the potential deaths of innocent creatures, sometimes seemed overwhelming. But each time his resolve wavered, he would remind himself of all the slights and humiliations he had endured over the years. He would think about the coronation ceremony, where Mufasa had been celebrated while he stood forgotten in the shadows. He would remember the pity in his brother's eyes when he had been given the hollow title of heir apparent. Most painfully, he would recall the joy and pride on Mufasa's face during Simba's presentation ceremony. These memories served as fuel for his determination, transforming doubt into rage and hesitation into commitment. By the end of summer, Scar had made his final decision. The plan would proceed regardless of the cost to himself or others. The time for half measures and subtle manipulation had passed. Now only decisive action would suffice. The irony was not lost on him that his transformation into a would-be regicide was complete, just as the Pride Lands were experiencing one of their most prosperous periods in recent memory. Under Mufasa's wise leadership, conflicts between species had been minimized. The delicate balance of predator and prey was being maintained, and the seasonal rains had been abundant enough to support healthy populations of all the kingdom's creatures. But this very prosperity was part of what drove Scar to desperate measures. The success of his brother's reign made it increasingly unlikely that any natural crisis would arise to provide him with an opportunity to seize power. If he was going to become king, he would have to create his own opportunity through deliberate action rather than wait for circumstances to change in his favor. The final psychological barrier was overcome during a conversation with Shenzi that took place in the deepest part of the elephant graveyard, surrounded by the bones of ancient giants and the twisted remains of thorn trees. The hyena matriarch had grown impatient with Scar's continued hesitation and decided to force the issue through direct confrontation. "You've been promising us action for months," she said, her yellow eyes gleaming in the moonlight. "But all we've seen is more talk, more planning, more preparation. My pack is ready to fight, but they need to know that their leader is ready to lead. Are you a lion or just another scavenger with delusions of grandeur?" The challenge struck at the heart of Scar's deepest insecurities, his lifelong struggle to prove himself worthy of respect and recognition. In that moment, all his doubts and hesitations crystallized into a single burning certainty. He would not be dismissed or underestimated ever again. "You want action?" he snarled, his green eyes burning with newfound resolve. "Then you shall have it. The time for subtle games has passed. Before the next new moon, Mufasa will be dead, and I will be king of the Pride Lands." The words hung in the air like a death sentence, transforming possibility into inevitability. There would be no turning back now, no opportunity for second thoughts or changes of heart. The die had been cast, and the fate of the Pride Lands would be decided by the outcome of Scar's desperate gamble for power. As he looked around at the assembled hyenas, seeing the savage anticipation in their eyes and the hungry smiles on their faces, Scar felt a mixture of exhilaration and terror. He had finally committed himself to the path that would either make him king or destroy him completely. The only question now was whether his carefully laid plans would prove sufficient to overcome the challenges that lay ahead. The morning mist clung to Pride Rock like a shroud, as Scar put the final touches on his most ambitious and terrible plan. Every detail had been considered, every contingency planned for, every possible obstacle identified and countered. The scheme that would unfold over the next few days would require perfect timing, absolute commitment from his allies, and a level of deception that would test even his considerable skills as a manipulator. The key to the entire operation lay in exploiting Simba's predictable weaknesses, his overconfidence, his desire to prove himself, and his susceptibility to challenges to his courage. Scar had spent months studying his nephew's psychological patterns, understanding exactly which buttons to push and when to push them. Now that knowledge would be put to its ultimate test. The plan began with a carefully orchestrated encounter between Scar and Simba near the watering hole where the young prince often played with his friend Nala. Scar approached with his usual air of casual indifference, as if the meeting were entirely accidental rather than the result of careful planning and patient observation. "Well, well," he said, his voice carrying just the right tone of mild surprise. "If it isn't my favorite nephew. You're looking quite grown up these days, Simba. Almost ready to be king, I'd say." The flattery was calculated to appeal to Simba's ego while simultaneously introducing the theme that would drive the rest of their conversation. Scar had learned that the most effective manipulation often began with compliments that made the target more receptive to subsequent suggestions. "I am ready," Simba declared with the confidence that only comes from youth and inexperience. "Dad says I need to learn more about responsibility and stuff, but I already know everything I need to know about being brave." "Oh, I'm sure you do," Scar replied smoothly. "Though I have to admit, I sometimes wonder if your father isn't being a bit overprotective. After all, when he and I were your age, we were already exploring the far reaches of the Pride Lands, places that most lions wouldn't dare to venture." The hook was baited perfectly. Scar had introduced the idea of exploration while simultaneously suggesting that Mufasa might be treating Simba like a cub rather than recognizing his growing maturity. The psychological pressure was subtle but persistent, designed to build over time rather than force an immediate response. "What kind of places?" Simba asked, his curiosity clearly aroused, despite his attempt to sound casual. "Oh, dangerous places," Scar said with studied nonchalance. "The kind of places where only truly brave lions would go. Places where shadows hide ancient secrets and the very ground tells stories of epic battles fought long ago. But I suppose your father is right to keep you away from such locations. After all, you're still quite young." The reverse psychology was flawlessly executed. By agreeing with Mufasa's caution while simultaneously describing the forbidden territory in terms that would appeal to a young lion's sense of adventure, Scar was virtually guaranteeing that Simba would become obsessed with visiting the elephant graveyard. "I'm not afraid of any old shadows," Simba protested, falling directly into the trap that had been set for him. "I bet I could handle whatever's out there better than you think." "I'm sure you could," Scar agreed readily. "But perhaps it's better to wait until your father thinks you're ready. After all, the elephant graveyard is no place for—" He paused dramatically, as if catching himself before saying something inappropriate. "The elephant graveyard." Simba's eyes widened with fascination. "What's the elephant graveyard?" Scar feigned reluctance to continue the conversation, a masterful touch that made his subsequent revelations seem like confidential information being shared rather than deliberate manipulation. "Oh, I probably shouldn't have mentioned. Your father specifically told me never to speak of it in front of you." This, of course, was a complete fabrication, but it served multiple purposes. It made the elephant graveyard seem even more forbidden and therefore more appealing, while also creating the impression that Mufasa and Scar had been discussing Simba behind his back in ways that suggested they didn't fully trust his maturity. "But I'm going to be king someday," Simba argued. "I should know about every part of my kingdom." "You're absolutely right," Scar agreed, as if this logic had just occurred to him. "A king should indeed know his entire domain. The elephant graveyard is, well, it's a place where the great tusked ones go to die. Their bones lie scattered across a vast wasteland beyond the northern border of our lands. It's dark, dangerous, and supposedly haunted by the spirits of the ancient dead." The description was calculated to appeal to every aspect of Simba's personality: his courage, his curiosity, and his desire to prove himself worthy of kingship. Scar could see the wheels turning in his nephew's mind, could almost watch the young prince convincing himself that a visit to this forbidden place would be a necessary test of his readiness to rule. "It sounds interesting," Simba said, trying to sound casual despite his obvious fascination. "Oh, it is," Scar assured him, "but far too dangerous for a young prince. Best to forget I ever mentioned it and wait until your father decides you're old enough for such adventures." With that, Scar excused himself and withdrew, leaving Simba to wrestle with the ideas that had been so carefully planted in his mind. The beauty of the manipulation was that it required no further intervention on Scar's part. Simba's own nature would do the rest of the work. As Scar had predicted, the young prince spent the rest of the day in a state of distracted fascination with the elephant graveyard. The forbidden territory had taken on an almost mythical quality in his imagination, becoming not just a place to explore but a test that would prove his worthiness to inherit the throne. When Nala arrived for their usual afternoon play session, Simba was bursting with barely contained excitement about his new knowledge. His friend, a practical and intelligent young lioness, was initially skeptical about the wisdom of venturing into forbidden territory. But Simba's enthusiasm was infectious, and his arguments about the importance of knowing their entire kingdom gradually wore down her resistance. "Besides," Simba argued, "we're not cubs anymore. We're almost grown up, and grown-up lions should be able to handle a little adventure. What's the worst that could happen?" This question, asked with all the confidence of youth, would soon receive a terrifying answer. But for now, it served its purpose of convincing both young lions that their planned expedition was not just safe but necessary. Meanwhile, in the elephant graveyard, Scar was meeting with his hyena allies to finalize the details of their operation. The assembled pack was larger than ever before, with dozens of spotted forms emerging from the shadows to hear their leader's final instruction. "Tomorrow," Scar announced, his voice carrying clearly across the bone-strewn landscape, "we strike the blow that will change everything. The young prince will come to us, driven by curiosity and pride, and when he does, we will be ready." Shenzi stepped forward, her yellow eyes gleaming with anticipation. "And if he doesn't come, if your manipulation fails?" "It won't fail," Scar replied with absolute confidence. "I know my nephew better than he knows himself. His nature will compel him to seek out the elephant graveyard, just as surely as a moth is drawn to flame. When he arrives, you and your pack will be waiting to give him the welcome he deserves." The plan that Scar outlined was both simple and devastating in its elegance. The hyenas would allow Simba and Nala to enter the graveyard and explore for a while, letting their confidence build and their guard drop. Then, when the young lions were at their most vulnerable, the pack would reveal themselves and launch a coordinated attack. "But remember," Scar cautioned, "this is not just about killing two cubs. This is about creating the crisis that will allow us to seize power. The attack must appear to be a random act of hyena aggression, not a planned ambush, and it must be dramatic enough to draw Mufasa himself to the rescue." Banzai snarled with anticipation. "And when the great king comes running to save his precious son, then we spring the real trap," Scar finished. "The stampede will be triggered exactly as we've practiced, and Mufasa will find himself caught in the path of 1,000 charging wildebeest with no way to escape." The mention of the stampede sent a ripple of excitement through the assembled hyenas. They had spent weeks preparing for this moment, studying the migration patterns of the wildebeest herds and identifying the perfect location for their ambush. The gorge where the final confrontation would take place had been scouted repeatedly, every rock and ravine mapped and memorized. Ed's mad laughter echoed off the ancient bones as he contemplated the chaos to come. The simple-minded hyena might not understand all the political implications of their plan, but he could appreciate its savage beauty. The idea of trapping the mighty Mufasa in a river of stampeding hooves appealed to his most primitive instincts. "What about witnesses?" asked one of the younger hyenas. If the cubs survive, they'll be able to tell everyone what really happened. Scar's smile was cold and calculating. Leave that to me. By the time our plan is complete, young Simba will be so consumed with guilt and shame that he'll never want to speak of this day again. In fact, he'll probably run away from the Pride Lands entirely, leaving the throne open for someone with the strength and vision to claim it. The psychological manipulation would continue even after the physical trap was sprung. Scar had planned not just Mufasa's death but also Simba's psychological destruction, ensuring that the rightful heir would remove himself from the succession through his own feelings of responsibility and guilt. As the meeting broke up and the hyenas dispersed to their assigned positions, Scar remained behind in the graveyard to contemplate the magnitude of what was about to unfold. Tomorrow would see the culmination of years of planning, the realization of dreams that had sustained him through countless nights of frustration and resentment. The irony was not lost on him that his moment of triumph would come in this place of death and decay. The elephant graveyard, with its bleached bones and twisted trees, seemed like the perfect setting for the birth of a new order built on the ruins of the old. Here, surrounded by the remains of giants, he would finally claim his rightful place as king of the Pride Land. But even as he savored his approaching victory, Scar could not entirely suppress a small voice of doubt that whispered in the depths of his mind. What he was planning went beyond mere political ambition. It was fratricide, the ultimate violation of family bonds and natural law. Once Mufasa was dead, there would be no going back, no possibility of reconciliation or redemption. The voice of conscience was quickly silenced by the stronger voice of ambition and resentment. He had come too far and sacrificed too much to turn back now. Tomorrow would bring either the fulfillment of his destiny or his complete destruction, and he was prepared to accept either outcome rather than spend the rest of his life in the shadow of his brother's greatness. As the sun set over the Pride Lands, painting the sky in brilliant shades of red and gold, Scar made his way back toward Pride Rock. To any observer, he would have appeared to be simply returning from one of his usual solitary walks. No one could have guessed that he was returning from the final planning session for the most audacious crime in the history of the Pride Lands. The stage was set, the players were in position, and the trap was ready to be sprung. All that remained was for Simba's curiosity and pride to drive him into the waiting jaws of destiny. The dawn of what would become the darkest day in the history of the Pride Lands broke with deceptive beauty. The sky was painted in soft pastels of pink and gold, and a gentle breeze carried the scents of wild flowers and fresh grass across the savanna. It was the kind of morning that spoke of new beginnings and endless possibilities, making it all the more tragic for what was about to unfold. Simba woke early, his mind already racing with excitement about the adventure that lay ahead. The elephant graveyard had haunted his dreams throughout the night, appearing in his sleeping mind as a mysterious realm where he could finally prove his courage and worthiness to inherit the throne. The warnings he had received from his parents seemed distant and irrelevant compared to the burning need to demonstrate his maturity. Nala was less enthusiastic when Simba shared his plans with her during their morning hunt training with the lionesses. The practical young lioness had spent the night thinking about the potential dangers of their proposed expedition, and her natural caution was warring with her loyalty to her friend and future king. "Are you sure this is a good idea?" she asked as they practiced their stalking techniques in the tall grass near Pride Rock. "I mean, if it's really as dangerous as everyone says." "That's exactly why we need to go," Simba insisted, his voice carrying the absolute certainty that only comes from you. "How can I be king of the Pride Lands if I don't know what's in every part of my kingdom? Besides, we're not going to do anything stupid. We're just going to look around and come back." The rationalization was perfect in its naive logic. Simba had convinced himself that his proposed visit to the elephant graveyard was not an act of rebellious disobedience, but a necessary part of his royal education. This self-deception would make it much easier for him to ignore the warnings of his parents and venture into forbidden territory. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Zazu, who had been sent by Mufasa to check on the cubs' progress with their hunting lessons. The red-billed hornbill's sharp eyes immediately noticed the conspiratorial tone of their whispered discussion, and his years of experience in royal service had taught him to recognize the signs of mischief being planned. "And what are you two whispering about?" he asked with the suspicious tone of an adult who knows that children are plotting something they shouldn't be. "Nothing," Simba replied too quickly, his attempt at innocence undermined by the guilty expression on his face. "We were just talking about hunting." Zazu's suspicions were confirmed by this obvious evasion, but before he could pursue the matter further, he was distracted by the approach of Scar. The dark-maned lion moved with his usual casual grace, but there was something different about his demeanor this morning, an undercurrent of tension that spoke of important matters weighing on his mind. "Good morning, Zazu," Scar said with his characteristic sardonic smile. "I trust you're keeping a close eye on our future king? We wouldn't want anything to happen to him before he has a chance to inherit his throne." The comment seemed innocent enough on the surface, but Zazu detected something troubling in its tone, a subtle emphasis on the word anything that suggested possibilities too dark to contemplate. His years of service to the royal family had taught him to read the nuances of lion politics, and he sensed that currents of danger were swirling beneath the peaceful surface of this morning. "Indeed," the hornbill replied carefully, "though I'm sure that young Simba is far too wise to venture into any unsuitable locations." The exchange was conducted entirely in code, with both adults understanding that they were discussing the elephant graveyard without directly mentioning it. Simba, however, was too focused on his own plans to notice the subtext of their conversation. If anything, their obvious concern only reinforced his belief that visiting the forbidden territory would be a significant test of his courage. After Zazu departed to attend to his other duties, Scar lingered for a few moments to plant the final seeds of his manipulation. His approach was masterfully subtle, designed to push Simba toward his desired course of action, without appearing to do so directly. "I do hope you're not planning anything adventurous today," he said with mock concern. "Your father would be quite upset if anything were to happen to you, especially if you were to venture somewhere you shouldn't be." The reverse psychology was flawlessly executed. By expressing concern about Simba's safety while simultaneously reminding him of the forbidden territory, Scar was virtually guaranteeing that the young prince would become even more determined to prove his courage. "I can take care of myself," Simba declared, his pride stung by what he perceived as yet another adult treating him like a helpless cub. "I'm not afraid of anything." "Of course not," Scar agreed readily. "You're your father's son, after all. Still, it would be wise to be careful. The world beyond our borders can be quite dangerous for young lions who venture too far from home." With that final warning, which was actually an encouragement disguised as concern, Scar withdrew, leaving Simba and Nala to finalize their plans for the expedition. His work was done. The psychological trap had been perfectly set, and now he could only wait for his nephew's predictable nature to drive him into the waiting jaws of doom. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of nervous excitement. As Simba and Nala prepared for their adventure, they told their parents that they were going to explore the southern grasslands, a harmless enough activity that would not arouse suspicion. The lie came easily to Simba, who had convinced himself that he was not really being deceptive, but merely protecting his parents from unnecessary worry. As midday approached and the sun reached its zenith in the cloudless sky, the two young lions set out on what they believed would be a grand adventure. They moved with the confidence of youth, secure in their belief that their courage and intelligence would be sufficient to handle whatever challenges they might encounter. The journey to the elephant graveyard took them through some of the most beautiful landscape in the Pride Land. They crossed rolling grasslands, dotted with acacia trees, forded crystal-clear streams that reflected the blue sky above, and climbed rocky outcroppings that offered spectacular views of the vast savanna stretching to the horizon. But as they traveled further from Pride Rock, the landscape began to change. The lush grasslands gave way to scrubland, the clear streams became muddy trickles, and the air itself seemed to grow heavier and more oppressive. It was as if they were leaving the realm of life and entering a place where different rules applied. The elephant graveyard itself was even more impressive and terrifying than Simba had imagined. Massive skulls and bleached bones were scattered across a desolate plain, creating a landscape that spoke of ancient power and inevitable mortality. Twisted thorn trees reached skeletal branches toward the sky, and the very air seemed to whisper of secrets better left undiscovered. Wow, Nala breathed, her voice small in the face of such overwhelming evidence of death and decay. This place is amazing, Simba finished, his eyes shining with excitement despite the ominous atmosphere. Look at the size of those tusks. These must have been some of the greatest elephants who ever lived. The young prince's enthusiasm was infectious, and despite her growing unease, Nala found herself drawn into exploration of the bone-strewn landscape. They climbed over massive rib cages, peered into empty eye sockets that seemed to stare back at them, and marveled at tusks that were longer than their entire bodies. For a brief time, it seemed as if their adventure would be nothing more than an exciting exploration of a forbidden but ultimately harmless location. They played hide and seek among the bones, competed to see who could climb the highest skull, and told each other stories about the magnificent creatures who had once called this place their final resting ground. But their innocent fun was being watched by dozens of yellow eyes hidden in the shadows between the bones. The hyenas had been in position since before dawn, waiting patiently for their prey to arrive and let down their guard. Now, as Simba and Nala became absorbed in their exploration, the trap was ready to be sprung. Shenzi was the first to reveal herself, stepping out from behind a massive elephant skull with the fluid grace of a predator that has found its prey. Her appearance was followed by Banzai and Ed, and then by dozens of other hyenas who seemed to materialize from the very bones themselves. Well, Shenzi said, her voice carrying a mixture of amusement and menace. What have we here? A couple of lost cubs, far from home and looking very tasty. The transformation in the atmosphere was instantaneous and terrifying. What had been an exciting adventure suddenly became a fight for survival as Simba and Nala found themselves surrounded by a pack of hungry predators with no way to escape. "We're not lost," Simba declared, trying to project confidence despite the fear that was beginning to gnaw at his stomach. "We're exploring our kingdom. Your kingdom." Banzai laughed, the sound harsh and ugly in the desolate landscape. "This isn't your kingdom, Keb. This is our territory, and you're trespassing." The situation was deteriorating rapidly, but Simba's pride prevented him from backing down or showing the fear that was beginning to consume him. Instead, he drew himself up to his full, admittedly modest height, and tried to assert his royal authority. "I am Simba, son of Mufasa and future king of the Pride Lands," he announced with as much dignity as he could muster. "You will show me the respect I deserve." The hyena's response was a chorus of mocking laughter that echoed off the ancient bones and seemed to come from all directions at once. Ed's cackling was particularly disturbing, a sound that spoke of madness and violence barely held in check. "Future king," Shenzi sneered, "you're nothing but a scared little cub who's wandered too far from home, and soon you won't even be that." The threat was unmistakable, and both young lions finally understood the true danger of their situation. They were outnumbered, outmatched, and far from any help. Their adventure had become a nightmare, and their only hope lay in escape or rescue. What followed was a terrifying chase through the bone-strewn landscape, as Simba and Nala ran for their lives, pursued by a pack of howling hyenas who seemed to know every hiding place and escape route in their territory. The cubs' smaller size and agility gave them some advantage in navigating the obstacles, but the hyenas' superior numbers and knowledge of the terrain made escape seem impossible. Just when it seemed that the young lions would be overwhelmed by their pursuers, salvation arrived in the form of a thunderous roar that echoed across the graveyard with the force of an earthquake. Mufasa had come, drawn by Zazu's frantic reports and his own parental instincts, and his arrival changed everything. The great king burst into the graveyard like an avenging angel, his golden mane flowing in the wind and his eyes blazing with protective fury. The hyenas, for all their numbers and ferocity, could not stand against the righteous anger of a father defending his child. They scattered before his advance like leaves before a hurricane. In the space of a few minutes, the nightmare was over. Mufasa had rescued his son and Nala, driving off their attackers and restoring safety to the terrifying situation. But the events that had been set in motion by this encounter were far from finished. The trap had been sprung successfully, drawing the king away from Pride Rock and into the isolated location where the real ambush was waiting. As Mufasa led his son and Nala away from the elephant graveyard, lecturing them sternly about the dangers of disobedience and the importance of staying within safe boundaries, neither the great king nor his charges realized that they were walking directly into the heart of Scar's carefully orchestrated trap. The rescue at the graveyard had been allowed to succeed. Indeed, it had been an essential part of the larger plan. The path that Mufasa chose for their return journey was not accidental. Scar had spent months studying his brother's habits and preferences, understanding exactly which route the king would take when traveling from the elephant graveyard back to Pride Rock. The gorge that lay ahead was narrow and deep, carved by centuries of seasonal floods into a perfect natural amphitheater for the final act of this deadly drama. High above on the rocky walls of the gorge, Scar waited with barely contained anticipation. Every detail of his plan had unfolded exactly as predicted. Simba had been drawn to the elephant graveyard by curiosity and pride. The hyenas had played their role as threatening but ultimately unsuccessful attackers, and now Mufasa was approaching the killing ground with his guard down and his attention focused on his son's safety. The wildebeest herd that grazed peacefully in the grasslands above the gorge numbered in the thousands. These massive creatures, each weighing several hundred pounds and armed with sharp horns and powerful hooves, represented one of nature's most devastating forces when set in motion. Under normal circumstances, they were placid herbivores content to graze and raise their young in relative peace. But when startled or threatened, they could become an unstoppable avalanche of flesh and bone. Scar's hyena allies were positioned strategically throughout the area, ready to create the disturbance that would trigger the stampede. The timing would have to be perfect. Too early, and Mufasa might have time to escape. Too late, and the king might pass through the gorge unharmed. Years of planning had led to this moment, and there would be no second chances. In the gorge below, Simba walked beside his father in uncharacteristic silence. The young prince was struggling with a complex mixture of emotions: shame at having disobeyed his father's explicit instructions, pride at having survived a dangerous encounter, and confusion about the moral complexity of the situation he had created. The lecture he was receiving about responsibility and the consequences of reckless behavior was having a deeper impact than usual, perhaps because he was finally beginning to understand the real dangers that existed beyond the protected boundaries of his childhood. "Simba," Mufasa said, his voice carrying both sternness and love, "you deliberately disobeyed me. Not only that, but you put Nala in danger as well. A king's first responsibility is to his people, not to his own desires for adventure or glory." The words cut deeply into Simba's conscience, creating the psychological wounds that Scar was counting on to make the final phase of his plan even more devastating. The young prince was already beginning to blame himself for the danger they had all faced, setting the stage for the crushing guilt that would soon overwhelm him completely. "I just wanted to be brave like you," Simba replied quietly, his voice small and uncertain. "I wanted to show everyone that I'm ready to be king." "Being brave doesn't mean looking for trouble," Mufasa explained patiently. "True courage is facing danger when you have no choice, protecting others even when it puts you at risk. What you did today wasn't brave, it was reckless." The conversation continued as they made their way deeper into the gorge, unaware that every word was being overheard by the lion who crouched on the rocky walls above. Scar listened to his brother's gentle but firm correction of Simba's behavior, and felt his resentment flare even brighter. Even in this moment of crisis, Mufasa was demonstrating the wisdom and patience that made him such an effective king and beloved father. The sight of his brother's parental devotion served as a painful reminder of everything that Scar would never have: the unconditional love of a child, the satisfaction of nurturing the next generation, the immortality that comes from seeing oneself reflected in offspring who will carry on one's legacy. These were gifts that had been denied to him by fate and circumstances, and their absence had created a hollow space in his heart that had gradually filled with bitterness and rage. But soon, all of that would change. Soon Mufasa's gentle wisdom would be silenced forever, and Scar would have the opportunity to shape young Simba's future in his own image. The thought of molding his nephew into a reflection of his own cynical worldview provided a dark satisfaction that helped to quiet the last whispers of conscience that still echoed in the depths of his mind. The signal came in the form of a carefully orchestrated howl that echoed across the grasslands above the gorge. To any casual observer, it would have sounded like nothing more than the normal communication between members of a hyena pack. But to those who knew the plan, it was the command to begin the attack that would set thousands of wildebeest in motion. What followed was a masterpiece of coordinated chaos. The hyenas emerged from their hiding places simultaneously, attacking the grazing herd from multiple directions with perfectly timed precision. Their goal was not to hunt or kill, but simply to create the maximum amount of panic and confusion in the shortest possible time. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The peaceful herd exploded into motion as thousands of wildebeest responded to the sudden threat with the only defense available to them. But with hyenas attacking from all sides, there was only one direction of escape available: down into the gorge where Mufasa and Simba were walking in unsuspecting tranquility. The sound began as a distant rumble, like thunder rolling across a far horizon, but it grew rapidly in volume and intensity, becoming a roar that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. The ground itself began to vibrate with the impact of countless hooves, and small stones started to fall from the walls of the gorge as the stampede approached. Mufasa's reaction was immediate and instinctive. His ears swiveled toward the sound, his muscles tensed for action, and his golden eyes scanned the gorge walls above for signs of the approaching danger. Years of experience as both predator and king had given him an intimate knowledge of the sounds of the savannah, and he recognized the approaching catastrophe with terrifying clarity. "Simba, run," he commanded, his voice carrying the absolute authority that had made him one of the most respected kings in the history of the Pride Lands. There was no time for explanations or questions, only the desperate hope that his son might be able to reach safety before the stampede engulfed them both. But even as he shouted the warning, Mufasa knew that escape was virtually impossible. The walls of the gorge were too steep to climb quickly. The distance to either end was too great to cover in time, and the approaching herd was moving with the inexorable force of an avalanche. They were trapped in a natural killing ground with no means of escape and no hope of survival. Simba's response to his father's command was immediate but tragically ineffective. The young lion began to run toward what appeared to be a climbable section of the gorge wall, but his small size and inexperience made his progress painfully slow. The gap between his maximum speed and the approaching stampede was closing with mathematical certainty, and it was clear that he would not reach safety in time. Watching from his vantage point above, Scar felt a complex mixture of emotions as his plan reached its climax. There was satisfaction at seeing his carefully laid scheme unfolding exactly as predicted, anticipation of the power that would soon be his, and a strange sense of detachment from the violence he was orchestrating. But underneath these dominant feelings was a smaller, quieter voice that whispered of the magnitude of what he was about to do. The first wildebeest appeared at the rim of the gorge like a dark wave cresting against the sky. For a moment they seemed to hesitate, as if sensing the danger of the precipitous drop that lay ahead. But the pressure from behind was too great, the panic too overwhelming, and the momentum too powerful to be stopped. With a sound like breaking thunder, the herd poured over the edge and into the gorge. What followed was a scene of chaos that defied description. Thousands of massive bodies tumbled and rolled down the steep walls of the gorge, their hooves striking sparks from the rocky surface and their bellowing voices creating a cacophony that drowned out all other sounds. The air filled with dust and debris as the very landscape seemed to reshape itself under the impact of the stampede. In the midst of this maelstrom, Mufasa made a choice that would define the final moments of his life. Instead of attempting to save himself, he turned back toward his son, fighting against the flow of the stampede in a desperate attempt to reach Simba before the young prince was overwhelmed. It was an act of pure parental love, the instinctive response of a father who valued his child's life above his own. The great king's strength and agility were legendary throughout the Pride Lands, and for a few heart-stopping moments it seemed as if he might actually succeed in his impossible rescue attempt. He leaped and dodged between the stampeding wildebeest with fluid grace, using his superior reflexes and intimate knowledge of animal behavior to navigate the chaos. He reached Simba just as a particularly large wildebeest was bearing down on the young prince, scooping his son up in his powerful jaws and tossing him toward a small outcropping of rock that offered temporary safety. The throw was perfect, sending Simba clear of the immediate danger and giving him a chance to climb to higher ground. But the effort had cost Mufasa precious seconds and had left him exposed in the heart of the stampede. As he turned to follow his son to safety, a wall of panicked wildebeest swept him off his feet and carried him deeper into the chaos. His golden form disappeared beneath a sea of dark bodies, and for several terrifying moments it seemed as if the great king had been lost forever. When the stampede finally passed and the dust began to settle, an eerie silence fell over the gorge. The walls that had recently echoed with the thunder of countless hooves now held only the whisper of wind and the distant calls of scavenging birds. The landscape itself had been transformed, reshaped by the passage of the herd into something alien and desolate. Simba, bruised and shaken but miraculously alive, began a frantic search for his father among the scattered debris of the stampede. His calls echoed off the gorge walls with desperate intensity, but there was no response except the mocking echo of his own voice. The silence stretched on, heavy with implications too terrible to contemplate. It was then that Scar made his appearance, descending into the gorge with the careful steps of someone who wished to avoid disturbing the scene of tragedy. His expression was a masterpiece of controlled grief, showing just the right mixture of sorrow and shock to deflect any suspicion about his role in the disaster. "Simba," he called out, his voice carrying perfectly pitched notes of relief and concern. "Thank the great kings of the past that you're alive. When I heard about the stampede, I feared the worst." The young prince ran to his uncle with the desperate need of a traumatized child seeking comfort from the only adult presence available. "Uncle Scar, you have to help me find Dad. He was here when the stampede started, but now I can't find him anywhere." Scar's response was to pull his nephew close in what appeared to be a comforting embrace, while his eyes scanned the gorge with the calculating gaze of someone who knew exactly what they were looking for. When he spotted the still form partially hidden beneath a fallen boulder, his expression shifted to one of profound sorrow. "Oh, Simba," he whispered, his voice breaking with what sounded like genuine anguish. "I'm so sorry, but I think I've found him." The discovery of Mufasa's body was a moment that would haunt Simba for the rest of his life. The great king lay motionless beneath a rocky outcropping, his golden mane dulled with dust, and his powerful form unnaturally still. There were no obvious wounds, no dramatic signs of violence, just the terrible absence of life in a body that had once radiated strength and majesty. Simba approached his father's body with the hesitant steps of a child who cannot quite comprehend the finality of death. His small paws touched Mufasa's still warm flank, and he whispered urgent pleas for his father to wake up, to open his eyes, to roar once more with the voice that had always made him feel safe and protected. "Dad?" Simba's voice was small and broken, carrying all the desperate hope of someone who refuses to accept an unbearable reality. "Dad, please get up. We have to go home. Mom's going to be worried about us." But there was no response, no flicker of life in those closed eyes that had once looked upon his son with such love and pride. The silence stretched on, broken only by the young prince's increasingly frantic attempts to rouse his father from what he desperately hoped was merely unconsciousness. Scar watched this heartbreaking scene with carefully controlled emotions, his face a mask of sympathetic grief that concealed the complex feelings churning beneath the surface. There was satisfaction at the success of his plan, anticipation of the power that was now within his grasp, but also an unexpected pang of something that might have been remorse as he witnessed his nephew's anguish. The psychological manipulation that would complete his victory had to be executed with perfect timing and flawless emotional pitch. Too much pressure too quickly might drive Simba toward defiance rather than self-blame, while too little might allow the young prince time to think clearly about what had really happened. The trauma of discovering his father's body had created a window of vulnerability that would not remain open for long. "Simba," Scar said softly, placing a paw on his nephew's trembling shoulder. "I know this is difficult to understand, but your father is gone." The stampede, it was too much even for someone as strong as Mufasa. The words hit Simba like physical blows, each syllable driving home the reality that he had been desperately trying to deny. His father was dead, killed by the very stampede that Simba's disobedience had led them into. The connection was not difficult to make, and the guilt that followed was overwhelming in its intensity. But if I hadn't gone to the elephant graveyard," Simba stammered, his young mind struggling to process the magnitude of what had happened. "If I had just listened to him, if I had stayed home like I was supposed to." Now, Scar interrupted, his voice carrying a mixture of comfort and carefully measured accusation. "There's no point in dwelling on what might have. What's done is done, and nothing can bring your father back." But even as he spoke words of apparent consolation, Scar was reinforcing the very guilt and self-blame that he wanted Simba to embrace. By acknowledging the connection between the young prince's disobedience and his father's death, while simultaneously suggesting that such thoughts were pointless, he was ensuring that Simba would become obsessed with his own responsibility for the tragedy. "It's all my fault," Simba whispered, the words emerging like a confession dragged from the depths of his soul. "Dad died because of me, because I had to prove I was brave, because I couldn't just do what I was told." The self-recrimination was music to Scar's ears, but he was careful not to show his satisfaction too openly. Instead, he maintained his pose of sympathetic uncle, offering comfort while subtly reinforcing the very guilt that was tearing his nephew apart. "You mustn't blame yourself entirely," he said, with apparent reluctance, as if admitting an uncomfortable truth. "Though I have to say, if you had listened to your father's warnings about the elephant graveyard, none of this would have happened. But you're just a cub. How could you have known that your actions would have such terrible consequences?" The manipulation was masterful in its subtlety. By appearing to comfort Simba while simultaneously confirming his worst fears about his own culpability, Scar was driving the psychological knife deeper into his nephew's wounded psyche. Each word was calculated to increase the young prince's sense of guilt and responsibility. "The pride will never forgive me," Simba said, his voice hollow with despair. "When they find out what I did, when they learn that I'm the reason Dad is dead." "Perhaps," Scar agreed with apparent reluctance. "Your mother, the lionesses, even your friend Nala, they all loved your father deeply. When they discover that his death was the result of your disobedience, their grief might indeed turn to anger. The shame of it might be more than you could bear." The suggestion was planted with surgical precision, taking root in Simba's traumatized mind like a poisonous seed. Scar was not just describing a possible future. He was creating the psychological framework that would make that future seem inevitable and unbearable. "What am I going to do?" Simba asked, his voice breaking with the weight of despair that no child should have to carry. "How can I go home? How can I face them knowing what I've done?" It was the perfect moment for Scar to deliver the final blow, the suggestion that would remove his nephew from the Pride Lands permanently and leave the throne open for his own ascension. But the recommendation had to seem to come from Simba himself, or at least appear to be the natural conclusion of his own guilt-ridden reasoning. "I don't know, Simba," Scar said with apparent sadness. Perhaps it would be better if you didn't go home at all. The sight of you might be too painful for your mother and the Pride, a constant reminder of what they've lost. Maybe the kindest thing you could do would be to spare them that pain." The suggestion hit Simba like a thunderbolt, but it also offered a twisted form of relief from the unbearable prospect of facing his family's grief and anger. If he was truly responsible for his father's death, then perhaps removing himself from their lives would be an act of mercy rather than cowardice. "You mean, run away?" Simba asked, his voice small and uncertain. "I mean find somewhere far from here, where you can start over without the burden of what's happened," Scar explained with apparent reluctance. "It wouldn't be easy, living on your own, but perhaps it would be better than staying here and watching the Pride suffer because of your presence." The logic was twisted but compelling to a traumatized young mind desperate for any escape from overwhelming guilt. Scar had presented exile not as abandonment of responsibility but as the ultimate act of selfless consideration for others. It was a masterpiece of psychological manipulation that transformed cowardice into nobility in the victim's own mind. "But what about being king?" Simba asked weakly. "Dad always said that someday I would rule the Pride Land. How can someone who caused such tragedy be trusted with the responsibility of leadership?" Scar replied gently. "A king's first duty is to protect his people. But you couldn't even protect your own father. Perhaps it's better if someone else takes on that burden." The final nail was driven into the coffin of Simba's royal ambitions with those words. Scar had not explicitly claimed the throne for himself. That would have been too obvious and might have aroused suspicion. Instead, he had made Simba conclude on his own that he was unworthy of kingship, leaving the succession apparently open while ensuring that he himself was the only viable candidate. "I can't stay here," Simba said finally, his voice carrying the hollow certainty of someone who has accepted an unbearable fate. "I can't face them. I can't live with what I've done." "Then go," Scar said softly, his apparent reluctance masking his triumph. "Go far from here, and try to find some measure of peace. Perhaps in time, the pain will fade, and you'll be able to build a new life somewhere else." As Simba turned to leave the gorge, his small form seeming even smaller against the vastness of the desolate landscape, Scar called out one final piece of advice that would ensure his nephew's continued exile. "And Simba, perhaps it would be best if you never spoke of what happened here today. The pain of reliving these events would serve no purpose for anyone. Let the dead rest in peace, and try to find some peace for yourself as well." The suggestion was the final touch of brilliance in Scar's manipulation. By encouraging Simba to remain silent about the day's events, he was ensuring that no one would ever hear the young prince's version of what had happened in the gorge. Without Simba's testimony, there would be no way to piece together the true sequence of events that had led to Mufasa's death. As the small figure of his nephew disappeared over the rim of the gorge, Scar allowed himself a moment of satisfaction at the complete success of his plan. Every element had worked exactly as intended. Simba had been lured into danger, Mufasa had died attempting a rescue, and the traumatized prince had been manipulated into voluntary exile. The throne of the Pride Lands was now his for the taking. But there was still work to be done. He had to return to Pride Rock, deliver the tragic news of the king's death, and assume leadership of the Pride during their time of grief. The performance would have to be flawless, showing just the right mixture of sorrow, shock, and reluctant acceptance of his new responsibility. As he began the journey back to Pride Rock, leaving his brother's body in the desolate gorge where it would soon be discovered by the search parties, Scar rehearsed the speech he would give to the assembled Pride. The story he would tell would be carefully crafted to explain Mufasa's death without revealing his own role in orchestrating the tragedy. The transformation from prince to king was finally complete, achieved through a combination of cunning, manipulation, and ruthless determination that had taken years to perfect. But as Scar walked through the gathering dusk toward his destiny, he could not entirely suppress the knowledge that his victory had been built on a foundation of lies, betrayal, and the blood of his own brother. The crown he was about to claim would be heavier than he had imagined, weighed down not just by the responsibilities of leadership, but by the terrible secret of how it had been won. But it was too late for regrets or second thoughts now. The die had been cast, and he would have to live with the consequences of his choices for whatever time remained to him as the king of the Pride Land.